Have any of you guys had a weird experience at the Payless on Greenbush when it comes to customer service? Anybody ever been there? Got any weird stories? It's the bane of my existence at this point. I've started going to the west side. I've converted. Partly because like my kids go to bed about 8 o'clock, and sometimes I have to go and get things that matter, or sometimes even a full load. And it seems like every cashier on the planet clocks out at Payless on Greenbush before I get there. There's been multiple times where I do a whole hour worth of grocery shopping and get up there and there's nowhere to check me out. They're like, well, you can use the self-checkout. I'm like, it's overflowing, massive cart. Like, what are you talking about? So I look like a crazy person up there trying to get everything to scan. Like, I don't have the speed, the agility, or the bagging skills necessary to get out there. So it takes me like 25 minutes to check out. I'd rather the drive, across the street. There's other been weird times right at the beginning of COVID. I get it. Everybody kind of temporarily lost their minds. We had all these massive restrictions. The plexiglass went up everywhere, and Payless started posting all of these signs that said no returns or exchanges, right? The idea, I think, is if you've taken it out of here, who knows if it's contaminated or not? We don't want to put it back in circulation. Like, I got it. I understood the impulse, especially when people were hoarding everything, right? Like, you'd go to the grocery store and you couldn't buy canned corn or anything else. And so, like, if you bought all that stuff, we don't want it back out of your pantry 2 months later. I understood the policy. However, I went one day and I did my grocery shopping and I grabbed a couple of gallons of milk. At that point, we still had to buy whole milk for Bryn to drink. And so we took a couple gallons of whole milk, put them in the cart, finished my shopping, checked out, got to the car, and as I was loading them into my trunk, I realized that one of the seals on the gallons of milk was busted. Not like it had been opened, but the actual part where it connects to the little band underneath was up over the bump. And so it's like, this was not a safe gallon of milk. Something had happened in transit or maybe in the bottling process. I was like, I don't really want to feed this to my 1-year-old at the time. So I walked back in, and we've had weird experiences with milk before. Like, have you ever bought one where the little bump is out on the side? And you're like, whoa. We'd previously gone to the store and said, hey, there's something wrong with this milk. Can we get another one? They're like, sure. So I walk in, and this dude's behind the plexiglass, right, with no personality whatsoever in the place for customer service. Like, come on, right? We can elevate the bar. And so I walk up, and there's the sign right in front of me. Like, I understand the policy, no returns or exchanges. So I say, hey, I just bought this gallon of milk, and you can see the seam is not where it's supposed to be. I wouldn't want to give this to my daughter. She's going to swap it out for another one. He just points at the sign and says nothing. I'm like, okay, I can read. I recognize that, but this seems like a different circumstance than what you're trying to prevent. I just want to not give my kids an infection, not give it to somebody else, right? So are you sure I can't just swap it out? He just verbatim says the thing again, staring at me with his eyes half closed and no emotion, like no returns or exchanges. Again, I'm like, I do totally understand the policy. So what do you want me to do with this gallon of milk I just bought? Do you want me to just pitch it and have to buy another one? And then he points to the trash can that's right there. Like, all right. And so, again, we need a little bit of help with our personality maybe at customer service. So I go ahead and, in fact, pitch the milk. I need one. I go back and get one, and I walk up to the cash register, and I talk to somebody who has a personality and say, hey, I just talked to the dude at customer service. I brought in a gallon of milk that I literally just bought. The seal was messed up. Can I get this one for free? And she's like, yeah, sure, no problem. That makes total sense. Boop, free. Like, come on, who's in charge here? What is the policy? What is the standard? What is the expectation? And if we don't have clear policies and expectations, it feels like our whole world's going to fall down. And that was the experience of a lot of people. I don't want to blame anybody during COVID. I understood the adaptation, but a little bit of personality and customer service is all I'm asking for. Anyway, there's another similar eyebrow-raising experience that King Xerxes has in the Book of Esther, where something doesn't go according to his plans and expectations, and everyone else is asking him, who's really in charge here? We're starting a series on the Book of Esther. It's a weird one. It's a book where you're like, why is this even in the Bible? Do you know that the name of God's never mentioned? There's no written prayers. There's no quotations of other scriptures. In fact, it's taking place during a time period between the captivity, right, where we get Daniel, where we're singing the song just about recently, or just earlier, like Another in the Fire. That's the story. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, right, during that era. Well, they were allowed to return to their homeland, and you've got Ezra and Nehemiah as they're rebuilding the walls and rebuilding the temple. This is happening, the Book of Esther, between when they're in captivity and when they're allowed to go home. The temple's not yet finished, but the people and the characters in this story are still in Babylon. It seems like it's weird. No prayers, no scripture allusions, no name of God. Why is it in the Bible at all? Well, we'll read it. Summer series are supposed to be lighthearted. I took the opposite approach. Let's read the story today. This is Esther chapter 1. These events happened in the days of King Xerxes. Remember Xerxes? Have you ever seen the movie 300? That guy? Who reigned over 127 provinces stretching from India to Ethiopia. At that time, Xerxes ruled his empire from a royal throne at the fortress of Susa. In the 3rd year of his reign, he gave a banquet for all of his noble officials. He invited all the military officers in Persia and Media, as well as the princes and nobles from all the provinces. The celebration lasted 180 days. That's quite a rager. A tremendous display. I love how the Bible describes this. A tremendous display of opulent, over-the-top wealth of his empire and the pomp and splendor of his majesty. It starts off like so different from other Bible books. By the way, the banquet that he's hosting here is to try to raise support, both in army and leadership backing and money for an attack that he's going to have on Greece. That is that 300 movie that you've maybe seen. His dad lost the Battle of Marathon. Remember where the dude from Athens runs all the way back, where we get our, 26 point something mile marathon. He drops dead to say, we've won the battle. He wants to return to that battlefront and win the victory his daddy didn't. So he needs all these people to be happy. That's why they're there for 180 days, like living up the life of luxury for half a year. The last thing that he wants is somebody to disobey his decrees or put, mud on his face in front of all of his buddies. Here's what happens. When it was all over, the king gave another banquet for all the people from greatest to least who were in the fortress of Susa, all the people who had to suffer the 180 days of the previous banquet. It lasted for 7 days and was held in the courtyard in the palace garden. The courtyard was beautifully decorated. Drinks were served in goblets of many designs. I think I skipped this section. Yeah. Oh, maybe not. Drinks were served in gold goblets of many designs, and there was an abundance of royal wine reflecting the king's generosity. By edict of the king, no limits were placed on drinking, for the king had instructed all of his palace officials to serve each man as much as he wanted. So everybody was inebriated. At the same time, Queen Vashti gave a banquet for the women in the royal palace of King Xerxes. Surprise, surprise, she wanted to have a separate party away from all the drunken male idiots out in the courtyard. Are you surprised? On the 7th day of the feast, though, her separation fails when King Xerxes was in high spirits. It's a great way to say drunk off his butt. On the 7th day of the feast, when King Xerxes was in high spirits because of the wine, he told the 7 eunuchs who attended him, "Bring Queen Vashti to him with the royal crown on her head, for he wanted the nobles and all the other men to gaze on her beauty, for she was a beautiful woman." Now, it's worth pausing for a second and asking, what is the text actually saying that Xerxes asking of Queen Vashti? Because you've probably heard this all over the map. Some people think the expectation was she came out in only a crown, right? Paraded and objectified. Other people have talked about his expectation of her to come out dressed suggestively. At bare minimum, from the text, he's expecting her to not have a veiled face and maybe have her hair shown. Which for us, in our day and age, we're not super offended by that, right? I don't see any women in the room today who have their hair intentionally covered and their faces intentionally covered. We don't really get to the offensive part unless we think she was like naked or suggestively dressed. But remember, that day and age, Persian women, especially those of kind of noble line, those who were part of the king's harem, the concubines, the queens, they always had their face covered, always had their hair covered. In fact, they were supposed to be his private possession. Again, bad language, but it's the truth of the day. Their possession. So they would travel in covered carriages so no one could see them. Simply, if it's only, and it may be way worse, but if it's only him asking her to come out with no face covering and her hair uncovered so everybody could see the beauty that he's supposed to see in private, that was an ask way below what the queen was supposed to do. So surprise, surprise, Queen Vashti doesn't want to be put on display and objectified in front of this room, this courtyard of drunken male fools. So here's how the thing continues. When they conveyed the king's order to Queen Vashti, she refused to come. This made the king furious, and he burned with anger. He needed anything but that kind of mud on his face at this moment, trying to raise an army and the spirits of all of his people. He's humiliated because his wife won't obey him at all. He needs faithful supporters, and now they're wondering, who's really in charge here, King Xerxes? We've seen all this opulence, all this wealth, all this wine. We get that you have resources, but if you can't control your woman, you've heard that language before, sadly. If you can't control your woman, how are you going to control an army? You could understand what's going on. So Xerxes is mad and he's drunk. Dangerous combination, especially for women in company. So immediately, this is verse 13, he consults with his advisors who knew all the Persian laws and customs, and he always asked for their advice. They met with the king regularly and held the highest positions in the empire. What must be done to Queen Vashti? That's the question he wants to ask his advisors. What must be done to Queen Vashti? What penalty does the law provide for a queen who refuses to obey the king's orders, properly sent through his eunuchs? Notice, this is not about proper orders. There's nothing proper about a king, a husband, asking his wife to be objectified publicly. He's not asking, what is the appropriate penalty for proper orders? He's asking, what's the penalty for orders that are properly sent, regardless their morality and expectation? He's sitting there thinking, look, I made my ungodly, immoral ask the right way. Why aren't I happy? You can hear the pity poor me party and all of this stuff and be like, man, how is this in the Bible? Like, this is the morality on display here. Also notice, women, you've probably felt the pain of this. It happens to guys too, but it seems to be more vicious the other way around. Queen Vashti isn't talked to. She's talked about. She never gets a voice in the story. She doesn't speak with the king face to face and say, here's why I didn't come. Here's the dishonor you were putting on me. We never hear from her perspective at all. She's just expected to be subservient, a subordinate. The exact opposite of what God's vision was in the message last week, if you remember. She's just talked about, not talked to. And some of you have experienced that so profoundly. And I couldn't even begin to understand, because usually the way I respond to people isn't talked about behind my back as improper or not womanly enough. When I speak up for myself, people cheer. Sometimes, ladies, when you speak up for yourself, people are like, who is that? Who does she think she is? When I dress weird, people just laugh. They're like, dude, that shirt's too tight. What are you doing? You got a gut on you right now. Ladies, when you decide to feel pretty, people squawk about you behind your back. Sometimes ladies are talked about, not talked to. You can understand Vashti's plight in this moment. And we learned last week from Paul at the end of the book of Ephesians that authority, especially in this husband-wife relationship, isn't about power, exerting top-down authority. It's about responsibility. As men rise to their responsibility in Christ, women submit and serve and honor because we're mutually submitting out of fear of Christ, not out of fear of what the man in the relationship's going to do because the woman is some kind of property. That is the reality that Vashti and all the other women are dealing with in the book of Esther. It's different than it is today. I wish we'd come farther than we have, but it's still pretty rough back then. So Vashti has by Paul's expectation, by biblical expectations, she has no reason to submit to this ungodly command of the king. But having godly principles run the kingdom of Babylon is not going to work. It's going to fracture the very unstable male-run authority system. So something has to be done. At least that's how the male advisors who are drunk with King Xerxes feel. Here's how it continues. Memucan, one of the advisors, answered the king and his nobles, Queen Vashti, listen to this. This is just pathetic. Queen Vashti has wronged not only the king, but every noble and citizen throughout your empire. Women everywhere will begin to despise their husbands when they learn that Queen Vashti has refused to appear before the king. I wonder why they would feel that way. There's probably an underlying issue in society if all the women are going to rebel against their husbands, right? Lord have mercy. Before this day is out, they warn, all the wives of the king's nobles throughout Persia and Media will hear what Queen Vashti did, and they'll start treating their husbands the same way. There'll be no end to their contempt and anger. Well, then there's probably problems that deserve their contempt and anger that need to be dealt with. The summary is this: Vashti didn't just dishonor you. She wronged everybody by protecting her dignity. It's pathetic. It still happens today. It happens in workplaces. I know. Some of the ladies in the room have experienced this sort of contempt before. So here's how the story continues. Their expectation, what they think should happen. So, if it pleases the king, shouldn't this say if it pleases the Lord? If this pleases God? Like, this is the Bible, right? Shouldn't we be asking God what we're supposed to be doing? Not in the Book of Esther. If it pleases the king, we suggest that you issue a written decree, a law for the Persians and Medes that cannot be revoked. It should order that Queen Vashti be banished forever from the presence of King Xerxes, and the king should choose another queen more worthy than she. When this decree is published throughout the king's vast empire, husbands everywhere, whatever their rank, will receive proper respect from their wives. Respect doesn't come from top-down power and authority. It comes from men rising to their responsibility in Christ. Not so in the Book of Esther. It's not if it pleases God, it's if it pleases the king, and those are entirely separate things. And big decisions with geopolitical implications in our world are still considered like this. We don't ask at the highest rungs of our authority what God would have us do. We need better leaders. We need better kings than Xerxes. We've got one in Jesus, but he doesn't always get the credit that he deserves. Just to show you, by the way that this verse and this section of verses has been contorted throughout history, I want to actually share with you a quote from Martin Luther. You know Martin Luther is the guy who started the Protestant Reformation. The guy who looked at the selling of indulgences in particular, but many other moral issues with the Catholic Church in medieval times, and said we need a better version of the body of Christ. And he started Lutheranism, and then we're all kind of descendants if you're not Catholic or Eastern Orthodox. So this is a guy revered by many traditions. I love reading some of his theology because it's so honest and raw. But I want you to hear his perspective on this story. It's painful. This is what he brings it up when he's talking about the reasons why divorce can be valid in the Christian life. Listen to this. The third case for divorce is the one in which parties deprive and avoid the other, refusing to fulfill the conjugal duty or to live with the other person. Here is a time for the husband to say, if you will not, another will. The maid will come if the wife won't. First, the husband should admonish and warn his wife 2 or 3 times. If the situation doesn't improve, she should let everybody else know her stubbornness and let it become a matter of common knowledge to be rebuked before the congregation. If she still refuses, get rid of her. Take an Esther. Let Vashti go. Like I said, I wish we'd come farther than we have to step into God's vision for what a husband and wife relationship is supposed to look like. Here's how the story continues in Esther. The king and his nobles thought this made good sense to them. We like this idea. We want our wives to listen to us and do whatever we say. So they followed Memucan's counsel, and he sent letters to all parts of the empire, to each province in its own script and language, proclaiming that a man should be the ruler of his home and should say whatever he pleases. So all the women in the land become subordinated, not because of Queen Vashti's decision. That's the way this is framed sometimes. All she did was protect her honor. They're not subordinated because it's God's will. They're subordinated because an ungodly king made a drunken, stupid decision, and it impacted so many innocent lives. This is the power of sin in the world, the power of sin in Esther's day. We have to get that straight. It's not Vashti's fault. It's the king's fault. Now, after this torrid episode is over, Xerxes has a chance to sober up. And you'd think, this is the Bible. When he gets clear-minded and he starts to think, that he's going to change his mind and do something better. Here's how it continues. After Xerxes' anger had subsided and he calmed down, he began thinking about Vashti and what she had done and the decree that he made. You'd think this is the time for God to show up, for him to be like, I was wrong. I was a fool. What I asked her to do was immoral, degrading, subordinating. You'd expect him to at least say, man, I shouldn't have done that. Really, what he should do is call Queen Vashti forward and apologize in public. The way he was trying to embarrass her in public, he should apologize in public. That's what we would expect to happen. That's not what happens. Instead, we get a more twisted version of The Bachelor than is on TV today. And by the way, The Bachelor's twisted. Some of you may watch that. I'm not somebody who likes to harp on pop culture, but goodness gracious, The Bachelor is literally a massive conglomerate of people having polyamorous affection and with strategic put in their infidelity, and we expect a monogamous, healthy relationship to come out of it. It's ridiculous. But Xerxes loves the idea of The Bachelor Babylonian style. Persian style, I should say. So his personal attendant suggested, chapter 2, verse 2, let us search the empire to find all the beautiful young virgins for the king. Let the king appoint agents in each province to bring these beautiful young women into the royal harem at the fortress of Susa. Hegai, the king's eunuch in charge of the harem, will see that they have all great beauty treatments. After that, the young woman who most pleases the king will be made queen instead of Vashti. This advice, surprise, surprise, was very appealing to the king. So he put the plan into effect. Because everybody knows, the way you make up for wronging one woman is to wrong every young, beautiful woman in the nation. How's God not intervening? How's he not speaking? Where's he at? It's a deafening silence in the Book of Esther. Now we're introduced to the main character. At that time, there was a Jewish man in the fortress of Susa whose name was Mordecai, son of Jair. He had come from the tribe of Benjamin and was a descendant of Kish and Shemi. His family was amongst those whom, when King Jehoiakim of Judah had been exiled from Jerusalem to Babylon by King Nebuchadnezzar. This man had a very beautiful and lovely cousin, Hadassah, who was also called Esther. When her father and mother died, Mordecai adopted her into his family and raised her as his own daughter. As a result of the king's decree, Esther, along with many other young women, was brought before the king to his harem at the fortress of Susa and placed in Hegai's care. Esther, let's get this straight, an exiled orphan is abducted into sexual slavery and drafted into a beauty contest, with the prize being somebody who actually has some semblance of a relationship with the king, not deprived of every kind of comfort a husband could provide. It's evil. It's wrong. It's atrocious. It's hard to even think through the cascading effects of Xerxes' prideful sin. But we're given a slight glimmer of hope, which is all we can expect in the Book of Esther. Hegai was impressed with Esther and treated her kindly. He quickly ordered a special menu for her and provided her with beauty treatments. He also assigned her 7 maids specially chosen from the king's palace, and he moved her and her maids into the best place in the harem. Now, we also learned through the text that Esther is forced to keep her nationality secret while she's groomed for 6 months for a one-night stand with the king. Talk about high pressure. Talk about evil. When the evening came, this is verse 14, that evening she was taken to the king's private rooms, and the next morning she was brought out to the second harem where the king's wives lived. There she would be under the care of a different person, and she'd never go to the king again unless he especially enjoyed her and requested her by name. Let that ruminate just for a minute. Let that sit. The king intends to deflower every beautiful young virgin in the land and then deny them the chance of a family and a husband. One night stand, now off where nobody can even see you again. You're mine, but you don't even get to hang out with me unless I really, really want you. It's evil. It's decrepit. It's just, how could this be happening? Now, in this beauty contest, Esther takes the advice of the eunuchs and she dazzles. Here's what we're told in verse 15. She was admired by everyone who saw her. Everyone is amazed, including, by the way, the king. Esther was taken to King Xerxes at the royal palace in early winter of the 7th year of his reign. This is verse 16 through 18. And the king loved Esther more than any other young woman. He was so delighted. This is on the screen. He was so delighted with her that he set the royal crown on her head and declared her queen instead of Vashti. To celebrate the occasion, he had a great banquet in Esther's honor for all of his nobles and officials, declaring a public holiday for the provinces and giving generous gifts to everybody. At this point of the story, when you're reading it, stream of consciousness, you almost want to cheer for Esther, like, yay, you did it, you won, congratulations. No one asks her if she's excited. No one asks her if this was the dream that she had for her life. It's really important when we look at these chapters to understand the foundation and what it's built on, because it's entirely abuse. Chapters 1 and 2. Think about Vashti, literally supposed to be subordinated and objectified in front of all the men in the area. Think also about the eunuchs who are attending these women. They literally were subjected to physical abuse to become eunuchs, and then unfortunately also oftentimes sexually abused in the ancient world. Think about all the poor servants who had to serve this drunken party for 180 days. Could you imagine what they were subjected to? And then also the random families throughout all the empire who were taxed heavily so he could have these opulent parties forever. And they can't put food on their table because they're sending all the money to the fortress at Susa. And now, too, a poor orphan, Jewish Esther, who has to break every Jewish law imaginable for a woman. Objectified, ends up marrying a outsider. All that where's God? That's the question. Where is he? Where's he at? What's he up to? Why isn't he speaking? Why isn't he judging? Shouldn't there at least be a prophet who shows up and yells at King Xerxes even if he gets killed? Where's the hope? Where's the grace? Where's the prayers? Esther doesn't even pray. We don't even know if she was a practicing Jew who even had a relationship with God. Why is this book in the Bible? Who's in charge here? Do you know that the story gives no actual clues as to whether or not we should be horrified when we read it or not? It's really left for us in different cultures and different times to try to interpret and draw our own conclusions. I definitely think we're not supposed to be amused by what happens. Even though, strangely enough, the Hebrew is kind of written in a way that's humorous. It might just be to take the edge off of how dark the situation really is. Sometimes we do that, right? The only way to make it through the pain is to kind of laugh about it a little bit. I do know this. The days of Esther were filled with gross self-indulgence, where other people paid the price. Sexual oppression, abuse, racism, bigotry, those were the laws of the land. We haven't come that far since then. It may not be publicly displayed the same way, written about the same way. In fact, sometimes we champion that nowadays. One of the things I really appreciate about the Bible, and one of the reasons I think the Book of Esther is in it, is because the Bible does not whitewash the evils of this world. It doesn't just simply put things in a spiritual perspective where we can be like, okay, buy real pain and suffering and separate ourselves from all the evils of the world and all the problems everybody has. Yay, Jesus. I'm going to go to heaven one day. I'll fly away. That's not what the Bible says. The Bible forces us to look at the horrifying underbelly of sin and human existence, stare it dead in the face, and then it begs us to ask the question, could God still be working? In the pain, through the horror, through the twisted reality of so many individual lives. And it's asking you to consider that about your life today. Through the crap that you've been through the junk that you're currently struggling with. If you read the book of Esther chapter 1 and 2, it does not say God is causing the pain, and he's not endorsing it, but somehow, some way, he's going to use it. The real truth of Esther 1 and 2 is that God can use even our worst folly to display his favor. He's not done with Esther's story. He's not done with mine. And he's not done with yours. God's name is never uttered in the book, but he's working all the time. Through all the pain, all the horror, this grand scale, like who could do anything against the evils of the king? Well, the psalmist tells us that God can. Listen to how Psalm chapter 2, this is your cue, Alan, how Psalm chapter 2, if you haven't already, how Psalm chapter 2 displays the folly of King Xerxes and what God is still going to manage to do through it all. This is what he says. Why are the nations so angry? Why do they waste their time with futile plans? The kings of earth prepare for battle. That's Xerxes. The rulers plot together against the Lord and against his anointed one. I can't speak today. Let us break their chains, they cry, and free ourselves from slavery to God. But the one who rules over heaven laughs. Maybe that's why there's a little bit of humor in the Book of Esther. The Lord scoffs at their plans, and in anger he rebukes them, terrifying them with his fierce fury. The Lord declares, I have placed my chosen king on the throne in Jerusalem, and it ain't Xerxes. On my holy mountain, the king proclaims the Lord's decree. The Lord said to me, you are my son. Today I have become your father. Only ask, and I will give the nations as your inheritance, the whole earth as your possession. I will break them with an iron rod and smash them like clay pots. Now then, you kings, how should you respond? Act wisely. Be warned, ye rulers of the earth. Serve the Lord with reverent fear and rejoice with trembling. Submit to God's royal son, or he will become angry, and you will be destroyed in the midst of all of your activities. By the way, King Xerxes loses the battle. He has almost 2 million people turned into 5,500. Submit to God's royal son, or he will become angry, and you will be destroyed in the midst of all of your activities. His anger flares up in an instant. But what joy for those who take refuge in him. I want to give you, as a summary, as we're wrapping up today, the words, really, it's a summary of chapters 1 and 2 from a female Bible commentator, okay? Because I think this is the type of message that can't simply be shared from a male perspective, at least not helpfully. So here's a scholar of all scholars who writes the NIV application commentary on the Book of Esther. Here's how she summarizes everything. The author, she says, does not begin with Mordecai or Esther, or even trying to retell the history of the Jews. He begins the story with a Persian king Xerxes, who neither knew nor worshipped the God of the Jews. Xerxes decides to give a banquet, apparently for purely political need to solidify support for his impending military campaign. A completely pagan king decides for purely worldly reasons to give a banquet designed for self-aggrandizement. On the last day of the banquet, he decides to treat the men of his empire to a good look at his beautiful Queen Vashti. This decision is probably not made from the most admirable of motives, you think? At least not as judged by Christian standards. With this, Xerxes sets in motion a chain of events that takes on a life of its own. In reaction to Xerxes, Queen Vashti, who is also not a worshiper of Yahweh, decides for whatever reason to refuse the king's command. She probably doesn't realize at that moment that her decision will change her life forever and bring another woman to the throne of Persia. With his one decision to display Vashti to his war council, Xerxes sets in motion a chain of events that culminates in the deliverance of God's people, fulfilling the promise of an ancient covenant made ages before in a faraway place. Even through the pain and the horror, God is working for his promises. God is working in your life. So today, if your life feels like it's fallen off the rails, he's working. Did you know that in my life recently, it felt like things fell off the rails? And I was literally asking God, like, where are you at? And why aren't you speaking? Like, what's with the silence? I need some voice here. Could use some help. What I've learned, literally just in the last month, is I don't have to rely simply on what I hear. I can rely on what I know, and I know a lot. I know that God is working. Like, I know that he doesn't cause the pain and the evil and suffering. I know he has a purpose, and it's better than I can even imagine. I know he hasn't caused my pain, and I know he has a plan. If it was true for Esther, it's true for me, and it's true for you. That God's not done with your story yet. Did you know that you're a miracle in the works? I believe that's true of my life. And I believe it's true of yours. I don't think Esther ever imagined that God would use her story to save her people. What might God do through your story that's not finished